So this is going to be a little lecture on ecosystems. We've already talked a little bit about individuals and what makes up an individual from cells through tissues and organ systems. And we've talked about populations, we've talked about species, and so now we're looking at really kind of the highest level of organization, the ecosystem. Ecosystems are complex. You can see here they're complex systems of plant, animal, fungal, and microorganism communities. So all the different things that are kind of interacting over here in this, for example, this forested habitat, things that are in the soil, different species interacting with each other, below ground, above ground, plus, of course, all of the things that you can't readily see in an image like this, like the animal communities that are living in the area. In addition to all these living things, there's kind of the non-living component. So you have things like, the topography of the site, where you have, for example, these mountain ranges here that are going to affect weather patterns. You might have kind of the soil type that's there, the different types of mineral compositions. You're going to have the amount of, sunlight that's coming in. So all of these, sorry, that's not written very well, but all of these are impacting this system. Now, the thing about ecosystems is they have no fixed boundaries. And that's one of the things that makes them kind of difficult to define and to really study, is because it's not like an organism where you can kind of determine what is part of the organism and what is not part of the organism. Here, the definition can vary. So you might have, for example, this little meadow in here, you could define as its own ecosystem. If you want to center in on kind of just this meadow ecosystem, but you could also define this entire region in here as maybe, some sort of northern temperate forest ecosystem that includes a variety of tree species, but also includes periodic meadows and lakes and ponds. So it really does kind of depend on what you're analyzing and the type of question you're asking that determines what boundary you place on these ecosystems. Now, on a larger scale, when they really get to kind of these larger sizes, we start to give them a different name. We call them a biome. And so kind of one way to think about that is when you're looking at a giant map, if you will, of the world, when you're looking at it at this scale, then you're starting to look at it from the standpoint of a biome. Looking at something as small as, a particular meadow or a pond would be too tiny on a map like this. So kind of when you think about the map scale, at this scale of, a full global map or a full state map, for example, you might be looking at it as a biome. One thing to, you can see here in the state of California, here's an example of a map of the different ecosystems of California. And again, they may vary depending on who's defining them. I put a circle down here that just show kind of in our area in Santa Barbara, down here, primarily what makes up our ecosystem. And so you have this chaparral, grassland, and you have this kind of what they call lower montane, which basically means kind of low elevation mountain type ecosystems. In this particular one too, they include human dominated ones. For example, in the Central Valley there, you have agriculture, the black areas here being urban. And so you could basically actually treat those as well as ecosystems. I mean, they have living components, they have non-living components, and they're all interacting. So defining an ecosystem does not necessarily mean it has to be one that's devoid of humans. One thing to keep in mind with biomes, like up in these regions here, for example, it's, if you look kind of across through this equatorial zone, you see all of these examples of tropical rainforests. Mostly what's determining that is climate. I mean, climate is having a big impact on how these biomes are distributed around the planet, because that climate will determine everything from things like temperature, it will impact rainfall patterns, and all of that, of course, then impacts the amount of vegetation and the types of vegetation that are there, and all the vegetation then determines largely what all the different animal species will be there as well. So let's look at just a little bit at this concept of what an ecosystem function is. And basically what these are, they're processes So the first thing to keep in mind, these are just things that happen in an ecosystem. Um, they don't have any they don't necessarily have any direct impact on human species, for example. And I'm highlighting that because when we start to look at ecosystem services, that's one of the things that basically differentiates them. And so you see down here, for example, we have things like provisioning wildlife habitat. So here's a big kind of watershed area here. This is in the Rocky Mountains. You can see that there's lots of different types of habitats in here where you have forest, you have streams right along in here, you have meadows. These are all different habitats for different communities of species. So that's kind of a classic example of wildlife habitat. You also have carbon coming into this system as CO2, becoming part of the plants through photosynthesis, right? We talked about that one in the past. And you also, of course, have carbon leaving the system as CO2 through the metabolism of all the animals that are consuming all of the kind of the food, if you will, all of the material in this system, and then respiring out carbon dioxide. There's an aspect of nutrient transition. So you have nutrients that are coming up, from under the soil into the plants. The plant, it's then building up in the plants. The plants then move those on into the animals, and these nutrients are flowing through the system, and you can follow that. So it could be things like nitrogen, it could be phosphorus, it could be potassium, and on and on and on, all the different types of nutrients that, for example, again, we've talked about when we're talking about how plants grow, how they produce themselves. So we can often characterize these ecosystems based off their functions and what are some of their primary functions and what scale at which they're operating and providing those functions. So how much carbon flow there is, for example, what types of habitats are generated, how much of a nutrient flow there is. And ecosystem ecologists will actually study those types of endpoints in a given system. Now, what's an ecosystem service? This is where you get this kind of difference. It's their ecosystem functions, but they have to be ones that are associated with and benefit humans. So they're providing something to humans that we're benefiting from. So we define this one. This is one that's like, what is the ecosystem doing for us? And this, for example, is a table that lists it. So it could be everything from food, where we're growing crops, we have livestock, we have fisheries, we have wild plants that we might be using for food. Here's fiber, timber, for example, for building materials, paper, cotton, hemp, silk, all those come from living systems. Genetic resources, biochemical medicines, fresh water, the idea that as water comes down through the watershed, it's getting filtered by the soil, by the microbes that are in the soil, by the roots and the root hairs of the plants. So the fact that we get clean, fresh water from rivers that could be potentially used for drinking or irrigation, that is a function of an ecosystem that provides us a valuable service. So we're getting all of these things from ecosystems. Air quality regulation, right? The production of oxygen, the filtering out of different toxins from the air. Climate regulation, which we'll talk about in a lot more detail later. This is the concept of climate change. The fact that, for example, ecosystems pull in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and that helps decrease the impacts of these greenhouse gases on warming our global climate. And the list goes on and on, disease regulation, pest regulation, pollination, and then you can even get into some of the more kind of cultural services. So spiritual and religious values, many, many different religions, indigenous groups find natural systems as critical components, sacred components to their spirituality, to their religion. Aesthetic values, that's one, for example, Santa Barbara benefits greatly from, because people come to Santa Barbara because of the beauty of our coastlines, the beauty of our mountains, the fact that they can recreate in the area, they can go surfing, they can go hiking. These are all things that ecosystems are actually providing for us. We take from them. We often don't fully evaluate them in our economy, but they're things that we're getting from these ecosystems as part of their just existence and function. we're getting a benefit from that. And so we define those as ecosystem services. Now, when you actually look at a given ecosystem, it's interesting that we've not been very good at creating the proper valuation of these ecosystems. And different studies now have tried to do that. They're starting to look at how can we actually create a more kind of equal and accurate economic valuation of an intact ecosystem. So, for example, if you have an intact wetland that's doing all these ecosystem services, you can see here that it actually has quite a lot of value compared to if you converted it into intensive farming. Now, intensive farming has a very clear economic benefit, right? You've got, food is coming from here. You've got jobs associated with it. And in the past, it'd be very hard to then equate that to an intact wetland because we may not actually be eating directly from that wetland, or people may not notice that they are. But if you looked at the different aspects of an intact wetland, for example, you may have many fish populations that depend on that wetland if it's freshwater, or even if it's an estuary where a lot of fish might come into a coastal wetland to reproduce. It could be providing clean water as a result of its existence. It could be flood protection. And so all of these different aspects now are being looked at and categorized and basically trying to create an economic value for them. In kind of one way to think about it is if they were not there, what would we have to do to replace that function? So if the intact wetland were gone, how much money would we have to spend to compensate for the loss of the fish, to create cleaner water, to address the increased threat from flooding? And you can see different studies, different components have done that with everything from forestry to mangroves to forest use. Now, when you total it all up, when you actually look at the global ecosystem value, it's, a lot of different numbers can be thrown around, but I think one of the most important things, kind of take-home message here, is different studies, one from 1997 and another one that came about in 2011, both showed that if you added up all of these ecosystem services and put a reasonable estimate of the economic value that we are getting from those services, that the ecosystem services are far more valuable than actually any of the other, if you added up all of the other human-driven economic benefits, the ecosystem services are greater than the entire global GDP, so gross domestic product of all the countries put together. Ecosystem services are actually greater than that. And again, what that points to is just looking at this system from an economic standpoint, just looking at ecosystem services, we would bankrupt the planet, bankrupt ourselves if we lost those ecosystem services. It would cost so much money to replace what we're getting basically for free, if you will, from these ecosystems, that it would destroy the entire global economy if we were to lose them. Another way to look at that is the benefits we get when we actually preserve and rehabilitate these ecosystems. So this example over here of the New York City watershed, New York City down here was looking at declines in water quality, and they were going to have to spend a significant amount of money to basically build and operate more water treatment plants to provide sufficient clean water for this large urban population. And they're looking at something like $6 billion price tag for construction of the new filtration facility and another $300 million a year for operating costs. But one of the things they noticed is that if they actually went upstream and they looked at these watersheds that were feeding into the city of New York, and they realized that if they actually just preserved and then rehabilitated these forest ecosystems up here, right? So think of, again, this ecosystem service. These forests were filtering water as it came down from rainfall, as it was moving through these systems, through different rivers and lakes and reservoirs that you can see here, like, different reservoirs that are here all along this pathway. That if they improved the ecosystem health and function of these forests, these watersheds, then the water leaving these watersheds and going into New York City was cleaner and required less treatment, and then actually allowed them to avoid all of these major economic costs. So here was a benefit, kind of a direct benefit of protecting ecosystem function for that incredibly valuable ecosystem service of clean water supply. And it really showed a direct economic benefit to the city of New York in decreasing the overhead for providing that critical need to a large urban population. So basically what we want to understand is you have these ecosystems, and they have this kind of overall function, and there's a lot of different types of functions. And then within that, we have these services that benefit humans. And these are critically important to us. We use them all the time, often without knowing it. I mean, think about every breath you take in is you're taking in oxygen produced by plants. The carbon dioxide that we exhale is also taken in by plants for photosynthesis. The waste we generate gets decomposed and turned back into available nutrients for plants. And that if we actually created a dollar value for this, it's an incredibly large amount of economic value that we take for granted oftentimes, and we don't often include it into our normal economic analysis. When we do include this in our economic analysis, then we actually find that in general, preserving and rehabilitating these ecosystems to ensure that their functions are healthy and that we're getting those services means that there's a great value to not destroying them, to not converting them into something else when we don't have to.